just want to say a few things before I go on to the PowerPoint. I'd like to acknowledge the late Alan Franklin, who, like me, was a clinician, a general paediatrician who listened to children and taught me a lot and was a pioneer, really, in recognising and validating ME/CFS in childhood, and wrote about it and also saw up to 500 children with it, and was a pioneer for the humane management of ME in childhood. He used to say, the trouble is nowadays we've trained a whole lot of scientific doctors who depend on investigations, and we don't teach them they've got to concentrate on taking a decent history. And I defy anyone, any doctor, to take a decent history from a child with ME/CFS and not believe in the genuine nature of that condition. And nearly all the horror stories I'm going to tell you about are about people who have never actually seen the child, sitting in secret meetings, conspiring among themselves to decide that this is probably Munchausen by proxy, but they've never seen or spoken to the child. And Alan Franklin said, we've got to realise there's some things we just don't quite understand yet, but we have to respect. It reminds me of my first funny story, and this was a 6-year-old girl in Edinburgh whose professor said, "But all your tests are normal." And she said, looking up to him, looking him fully in the kneecap, "Yes, but maybe I've got a condition for which you have not yet invented the right test." There's also something funny. I know it's pretty terrible for adults to have ME, it's pretty terrible for children to have ME, and I'm still not quite sure which is worse. It's probably best not to get ME until you're about 89, just before you die. But there is something peculiar that ME does to doctors confronted with it. And I always remember a story Anne McIntyre tells about a 14-year-old doctor's son in Australia who got it and was ferried around all the experts in Australia for a year. And someone said to him at the end of that, "You must have learnt a lot from all the clever doctors you've seen." He said, "Well, not much. I don't really understand it." But he said, "There's one thing I've noticed. It's a condition which induces an acute psychological disturbance in doctors confronted by it." And seriously, the really severe cases which are treated so terribly, I told a series of stories to Chris Clark, the former chief exec of AFME, and he said at the end of the story, he said, "There's something sadistic about this, isn't there?" And I think there's something about some of our professions that they see something weaker and they actually say, well, now I'm in a position of power, and it affects doctors and social workers. There's one further question which I'd like to offer to all the research workers here today, and if they could possibly sort this out, it would be a very interesting thing. And this came from the innocent observation of a man who'd cycled from Land's End to John O'Groats. I've got a fellow feeling because I'm doing it next week. And he raised £10,000 for AFME. And when he gave this £10,000 in, he'd been put up with ME sufferers' families all the way and had done an extra 200 miles zigzag up the country. He said, "I didn't know much about this condition before I did this bike ride, and I have met a lot of people with it. And there's one thing about this condition I still don't understand." He said, "Does it only affect nice people? Or can it affect anyone, and then does it turn them nice?" And it might be that there's a mitochondrial explanation for niceness there, which you inherit from your mother or something. But I have yet to meet a family who I haven't found really super with ME, and I know a hell of a lot of bastards in this world who don't seem to have caught it yet. One other thing before I start. We're still rearing a generation of doctors in this country. The two main textbooks, Coomer and Clark for medicine and Forfer and Arneal for pediatrics, both of whom don't mention the word ME. It's an unofficial disease, but they call it chronic fatigue syndrome, but they put them both in the psychiatry section. And the Forfer and Arneal says it is one of the commonest somatization disorders of childhood. So if anyone says the Chief Medical Officer's report settled it once and for all, it should have done, but the doctors haven't listened. I'm just going to talk really about my experience, my overview, my bird's eye view of what's been happening to children since Alan Franklin and I both took such an interest in this over the last last 20 years. And both Alan Franklin and I had exactly the same experience. A girl would come to our clinic in a wheelchair and announce that she had ME, and we'd never heard of it before. So we said, tell us about it, and we both respected them and learnt, and then began to recognise it. I also learned to recognise it after hearing Betty Dowsett give a brilliant clinical presentation. I said it's a problem being anyone having ME, but if you're a child, there are particular difficulties as well, because, as you all know, children don't just belong to parents, they belong to the state. The illness we know enough about. It's the biggest cause of educational loss of any medical condition in this country. And you all know about the different ages that children can get it, and it is surprising. The kids who get it from 5 to 12 seem to just get on with life, but being an adolescent is bad enough without having ME as well. And I think David Bell, the great American pediatrician, said the trouble with having ME as an adolescent, if you've got it severely, is it puts on hold the tasks of adolescence, and you have a sort of delayed adolescence if hopefully you improve. But the biggest problem, and this is what I'm going to talk about most, are the problems with professionals, and I've already joked about that a bit. And the big thing, of course, is disbelief, as perpetuated by the textbooks. And these are the famous quotes. It doesn't occur in children. Last week I was in Somerset helping the court to decide not to take a 9-year-old boy into care because the local paediatrician said he couldn't have ME because he was too young. That was the main reason, apart from the fact he was too hurried and didn't have time to take a proper history. It was quite complicated and he didn't do any harm, but he failed to protect the boy with a diagnosis. There's a famous adolescent paediatrician who writes for the famous medical journal The Sun, and he says ME only lasts 12 months. Of course, you're not allowed to be diagnosed for 6 months, so you have a narrow window of opportunity. And I wrote to him, but The Sun said he doesn't enter into correspondence. Where does he get that idea from? And this is the worst thing. I've heard several people talking about this. I've seen paediatricians who can believe in and tolerate and treat humanely children with mild and moderate ME. And I once had a child who I'm going to talk about soon who is in the hands of a paediatrician who was just like that. But when they become severe, the disbelief kicks in again, and they doubt the whole diagnosis, and nothing more frightens a doctor than the feeling he's missed the diagnosis of something. So this is where all the disbelief and the alternative explanations of Munchausen by proxy and pervasive refusal syndrome kick in. And of course, there's also the textbook orthodoxy that as long as you've got a multidisciplinary approach, it's going to work. I've never quite understood why 10 people stirring a pot makes the pot better than if one person stirs it, but this is orthodoxy. So you have your multidisciplinary approach, and rather like a First World War general who orders an attack, if it works, you get the credit, and if it doesn't, you blame the men for cowardice and order them to repeat it the next day. So you blame the victim if your treatment doesn't work. Okay? And the problem is the belief system. These are GP quotes. Their whole practices where they seem to have an embargo, they've all got together and said, no, we're not going to have it in our practice. Of course, children don't get it. Don't believe in labelling. That's interesting. That's from a chap who labels duodenal ulcers, myocardial infarctions every day of his week, but we mustn't put a label on them. We used to cover up asthma the same way. And I don't like diagnosing things for which there's no treatment. It makes me feel helpless, you know? And it is a crazy thing. I tell all doctors I train that patients will forgive you if you haven't got a treatment, as long as you're nice to them and validate them. And all my Christmas cards are from ME sufferers who I haven't actually cured. So there has to be a lesson there. But doctors like to feel in control, and they like to feel they've got treatments. And, of course, there's this is what I call the logic of the orthopedic surgeon, and leads to one-way tickets to psychiatry. And I've also seen, because I've seen so many children who've been hurt and damaged by other doctors, I've seen a lot of stories. One of the worst was a boy who saw a consultant, I think he was an infectious disease consultant, setting himself up as an amateur psychiatrist. He said, well, all the tests are normal. This was to a 14-year-old boy. So I think all your troubles are due to worry. And he said, oh yeah, and what worries do you think I've got? And he said, oh, well, you're a 14-year-old boy. In my experience, most 14-year-old boys are worried about girls, so it's probably because you're worried about girls. Probably says more about the doctor who's still... There are a lot of consultants who think it's orthodox in terms of a holistic approach involving the child psychiatry department to go from that to actually a one-way ticket and accidentally not to follow them up, which is actually a rejection. It is funny when you have a consultation with a doctor how finely balanced it is whether you get another follow-up appointment or not. And a lot of paediatricians are quite honest. They say, I don't think there's much I can do for you. Good luck, I hope you get better, goodbye. I prefer that to the persecutors anyway, but a lot of them, children are still at risk from non-school attendance and the educational pressures, and they do deserve to have a consultant who at least keeps them on their books. And I think having a paediatrician to protect you with the diagnosis throughout your childhood is important. I often tell doctors that ME families are potentially paranoid before you've started. I think there's a truth. I think we know why you're paranoid. There's a collective subconscious of paranoia. And I know a chap who was handling a case very reasonably for 2 years, but he left the clinic to his registrar, who told the child that she should be doing more gym and cross-country and forcing herself. And they lost confidence not just in her, but in the consultant who had delegated to her and refused even to see him again. That's a bit over the top, but it shows how easily people can be disengaged. And that's another way of provoking the family. And then, even if you're not nasty to them, you've got to actually support them. You've got to give them, there are lots of practical things you can do to families, and there are pressures inbuilt in the educational system. I know a family who immediately said they were going to home educate their child, and they said it was the best thing they ever did, because no one ever hassled them again. Their daughter went back in the sixth form and never looked back. But they had no problem with professionals. Everything comes from the educational system. I had a family who moved up from Surrey, and their daughter had been not seen by a paediatrician for 3 years because she wasn't well enough to get to clinic and was therefore discharged for non-attendance in the clinic. Now, the one thing we wrote into the college guidelines is that it's a paediatrician's duty to visit at home their patients who aren't well enough to see them. Sounds a rather radical idea. Trouble is, visiting at home used to be a rip-off financially, and people used to fiddle the system to get money, so everyone said, once they were caught out, they said, right, I'm not going to visit anyone at home again. You all know this, pressurizing school attendance. I know most people are pretty unhappy with the strength of the guideline, the nice guidelines that have been drafted. Just remember that all medical management, whether it's having a heart transplant or a defibrillator put in or whatever, all medical management is subject to informed consent. You don't have to agree to something the doctor recommends, a child, family, or anyone. So you can say, thanks very much, but no thanks. As one father said, you can set my daughter targets till you're blue in the face. You can put her down for the London Marathon next September. Doesn't mean she's going to do it. But there's always a threat of court orders behind this. And people who annoy the professionals and withdraw from them or attack them can get threatened with court orders. This is a girl from the Midlands who was under this nice, cuddly paediatrician who treated her perfectly well. And she was the only eldest of 2 children to a single mother, risk factor. I think about 80% of my care proceedings have been single-parent families. She used to be in perfect health, and she was full of the joys of spring, and she was auditioning for the part of Maria in the local repertory company, Sound of Music. And then she got acute onset of severe ME and was so bad she had to be hospitalized. Okay, so the first 3 months she was hospitalized. And once she got into hospital, although she was under the paediatrician, a multidisciplinary team kicked in, dominated by a child psychiatrist, a physiotherapist, an occupational therapist, and a community paediatrician who was very keen to get the child back to school. And the nice, cuddly paediatrician was just sort of elbowed out of the way. And the regime of graded activity could be a very gentle one, but this was a rather forceful one. The physiotherapist had her for 2 hours every morning. And the mother tried to protect her. The nurses left the food outside her reach, and she wasn't ambulant. And the mother would often come in and find she hadn't been fed or there was food running down. And the minute mother came in, she'd have to gather her up and put her to bed and draw the curtains round, and Tiffany would dissolve into tears, and the nurses would write down, "Mother came in, Tiffany burst into tears, mother picked her up, put her on the bed," made it look as if she was being overprotected. And of course, she didn't get any better. She actually got worse with this regime. So that was mother's fault for undermining it. So she was told she could only come at 4 o'clock after the physio had finished with her. And Tiffany had to sit in her wheelchair with her head like that, listening to the targets for the next week. Okay? Not surprisingly, she got worse. And she was desperately unhappy, obviously. She'd lost her autonomy. People were telling her to do things. Her mother could only come now and again. And the nice paediatrician said, "I'm sorry, we don't seem to be doing much for her. You might as well have her at home." So she took her at home, but the mother was forced to sign a discharge against medical advice. And then some more doctors kicked in, a very steely lady GP who insisted on cross-examining Tiffany in private for half an hour at a time. Despite her having refused, she insisted on it and reduced it to tears each time, and finally rang social services saying she was unhappy about her mental state. And that activated child protection proceedings, and the police came and took her to hospital against her will. And at that stage, they went to court, and at that stage, I was called in by the guardian, and I went to visit her, and I found a very broken, demoralized girl sitting miserably, who said, I have to go into foster care for 6 months. And I said, well, it's not necessary. You've got a voice. You can tell people what you think. The social services have to listen to you. And I gradually re-empowered her. And she told the nurse, "Can you call my guardian? I want to speak to her." And the nurse said, "All right." And I said, "Did you ever talk to the nurses? Did you ever get a sympathetic nurse?" "Oh, yes, there's a really nice junior nurse." And I used to tell her. And she'd go and tell sister, but she'd write it down a different way. She'd twist what I'd said. And I said, "Is there anything you'd like to tell me you want?" And she was so demoralized, she didn't say, "Can I go home to my mother?" She said, it's my birthday next week. Do you think I could possibly see my mother without a social worker present?" Because all visits had to be supervised because this was Munchausen by proxy. This was only 4 or 5 years ago. The court, fortunately, dropped the care proceedings and she went home and is now doing a degree in astrophysics in the Open University, and sent me a beautiful photo of her doing a trapeze. She's still only about 60%. And if she cried during her mother's visits, let's say we'll stop her visiting altogether. Imagine this map with almost 3 times the number of yellow spots and twice as many red spots. All the yellow spots are children who've had to see me at long range because they couldn't get a diagnosis or they were under threat from the local professionals. And I had to see 2 even when I went on holiday in Scotland. I saw them in the Inverness Station Hotel. A boy from Aberdeen was very interesting. He actually had Lyme disease, which triggered ME. And once he'd been treated for Lyme disease, everyone lost interest in him. But all the red spots are the horror stories. They're all the care proceedings. And the total now is running at 20. And I'm glad to say we've won 19 out of those 20. They opened a special clinic for ME in Cardiff and diagnosed the first 2 cases that turned up as Munchausen by proxy. Just a quick overview of a follow-up study I did. This was in the 1990s. And we found this very interesting prior diagnosis of migraine, which is very statistically significant, very interesting about genetic predisposition. Also, the first-degree relative, interesting to hear, it was probably a mother. A total school loss of 89 years, cumulative loss among that 49 cases. So the average child lost 2 years of school, and some of them lost no school at all, so a lot of them lost. It was a 6-year follow-up. It was a widely fluctuating and unpredictable illness. I think we're all used to the idea that the prognosis is more optimistic in childhood, and this is the happy graph, which shows a third of the children making, to all intents and purposes, a full recovery. And as you'll see, they are among the milder of those ones. So none of them were very severe at any stage. So if you have to have ME, it's probably best to have it mildly. I'm sure you know that. But look at the wild swings that still occur. And a lot of these, like the case we heard this morning from Dr. D'Amelia, are triggered by a virus infection or severe flu after they had it, a double whammy. And these are the unlucky ones. And here it shows there's no rules. You can have it mildly and end up severe. And the severe ones, some are severe all the way through, and the others have these wild fluctuations. They're a very small group. So that's 7 of the 49. And most of them have this massive in-between, an overall slight trend to improvement, some very severe cases. And fortunately, I've got, of the 6 very severe cases, 3 of whom needed tube feeding, all 6 have made a full recovery. So you can have it very severely and still make a full recovery. Interestingly, I gave all of those patients immunoglobulin. And we still, I think the immunoglobulin question in the early stages is still open. There's never been a trial using immunoglobulin in the first 6 months. They've all just been long-standing cases. Again, just to talk about this sort of natural sadism in the medical profession. This student I said, I'd like to convince you ME's genuine organic condition while you're staying with me. He said, you don't need to convince me, I've had it. He said, tell me your story. He said, well, I was up at Oxford doing PPE and I came crashing down with it at the end of the first year, couldn't get back to university. I was referred to my local district general hospital and saw a physician. I expected him to treat me with respect and take a story. He didn't even speak to me. He looked at the letter from the GP. He asked the nurse and the other medical student to leave, and he proceeded to tear a strip off me and say if I hadn't the guts to complete a university degree in these days of high unemployment, I should make way for better people. And as he limped home, pale and weak, he said, I could make a better doctor than that chap. So he changed to medicine. I'll have to skip some of these, but this is a girl who never knew what she had and why she'd never been able to get to college, who'd never seen a specialist and been under GP care only. And I found her at an AIM conference in Milton Keynes in her wheelchair, sobbing. And I said to the mother, why is she upset? She said, don't leave her alone. Those are tears of happiness. I said, why is that? She said she's just heard Dr. David Bell give a lecture on ME, and she realizes there's one doctor in the universe who understands what she's been suffering from. So it is sometimes worth diagnosing something, even if you haven't got a tremendously good treatment for it. That's the boy with Lyme disease. His GP was so scared of getting into trouble that he made that boy come to see me every 6 months, because otherwise he wouldn't give him sick notes. He wasn't confident enough as a doctor to say that that chap was sick. That's an absolute horror story which I haven't time to tell you about, and as I say, I've had 20 cases. Don't think we've time to go through this. The CMO's report was extremely good. Lots of us here sat on that, and I think we haven't exploited it enough. It wasn't distributed enough, and there's still doctors who can say, nah, a load of rubbish. But it was much better than the dreaded Royal College. And remember the Royal College's report in 1996? Immediate return to school should be encouraged and home tuition should be discouraged. And if they don't attend school, there are legal sanctions. There's a funny breed of paediatricians called community paediatricians who sit behind desks and stick flags in maps to see which children aren't attending school. And they can sometimes be party to care proceedings of children they have never spoken to because they're not happy. And you should watch out for them.